Buenos días, good morning, welcome everyone to this very, very special seminar. It is special not only because this is our first in-person seminar in the past 3 years, but most importantly, we have an amazing guest today, Dr. Laura Pulido. Before I do formal introductions, I want to take the time to thank you for being my mentor. Thank you for your guidance, for your friendship, for your support. You inspire me. I admire you so much as a scholar, as a thinker, as a friend, and as a person. Thank you so much. I also want to acknowledge our co-sponsors that make this event happen. It is the Eminent Mentors Program, the Latinx and Hispanic Faculty Association, the Center for Social Science Scholarship, the Dresser Center for the Humanities, the Global Studies Program, the Latin American and Caribbean Feminist Working Group, and the Alvin Open Library and Gallery. So as you can see, we had a lot of support. It actually does take a village to make these things happen. So thank you so much, everyone. Well, now I'm going to go ahead and do the formal introduction. Dr. Laura Pulido is the Collins Chair and Professor in the Department of Indigenous, Race, and Ethnicity Studies, and also in Geography at the University of Oregon. She studies race, landscape, environmental justice, and cultural memory, and is the author of numerous powerful articles and books. I'm going to just go ahead and name a few books. One of them is Environmentalism and Economic Justice, Two Chicano Struggles in the Southwest. The other one is Black, Brown, Yellow, and Left, Radical Activism in Los Angeles. And she's also the co-author of A People's Guide to Los Angeles. Dr. Pulido has received numerous honors, including the Presidential Achievement Award and Distinguished Scholarship Honors from the American Association of Geographers, the Colon Medal for the American Geography Society, and the Ford and Guggenheim Fellowship. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Pulido.
Thank you for that wonderful, warm welcome. And I'm so happy to be here and to help reignite community here at UMBC. It's wonderful. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay, thank you. So I would like to begin my talk with a land acknowledgement. And I know that these are fashionable things to do these days, but much of my talk is about native dispossession and how we deny it. Consequently, I want to call attention to the historicity of the land acknowledgement. I come to you from Kalapuya Ilihi, also known as Eugene, Oregon. Kalapuya Ilihi was home to the Kalapuya people before their land was taken by Euro-American settlers, and they were forcibly relocated to the Oregon coast by white settlers using a diversity of strategies, including the Oregon Donation Land Claim Act. Today, the Kalapuya are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. They are active members of the community and remain caretakers of the land. The fact that I begin with a land acknowledgement reflects the moment that we are living in. As we all know, the U.S. racial formation is undergoing profound changes. On the one hand, awareness of white supremacy and anti-racism is widespread. On the other, we are living through the latest chapter of white backlash. This backlash can be seen in numerous ways, including physical attacks against anti-racist activists, the mainstreaming of white nationalism, and declaring war on critical race theory. As of March 2022, 39 states had introduced over 60 pieces of legislation that curtail what teachers can say about race. In this map, the gray pentagons represent the states where no such bill has been proposed. There are only 11 such states, including Puerto Rico. These bills vary in their scope, ambiguity, and provisions. For example, some require that teachers tell both sides of racial issues. Others require that no one is made to feel discomfort when discussing the racial past. And still others, such as North Dakota, prohibit teachers from presenting racism as anything other than individual biases. In other words, there is no such thing as structural racism. These debates about CRT are also debates about cultural memory. That is, how we choose to remember the racial past. Why exactly is this so contentious? Never would I have imagined that such discussions and ideas would have been banned, but that was foolishness on my part. Because even a cursory look at US history shows a deep investment in white innocence and a desire to preserve it at all costs. In this talk, I explore how US cultural memory represents white supremacy and colonization. What I'm going to do today is first provide an overview of the contemporary public discourse around cultural memory. Second, I'll be talking about white supremacy and denial and white innocence. Next, share my research questions and methods, and finally present my findings. So let's start with simply just defining cultural memory. I define it as popular understandings of the past, which of course is quite distinct from actual history, which is supposed to have some kind of attachment to the facts. Well, cultural memory has always been important. It has increasingly become a site of public contestation. Arguably, the current wave of contestation began with Bree Newsom, who climbed the South Carolina State House in 2015, for which she was promptly arrested. Well, this attracted major public attention. Others have been quietly working on this topic for years. This is a picture of the Equal Justice Initiative, which is a project based in Alabama, and they have been trying to create markers of all sites of lynchings in the southeastern United States. The other picture is of Sandra de la Rosa, who is a LA-based artist and activist, and she here is doing some of her guerrilla performance art. She goes around to sites about the Mexican-American War. She takes down the official ones, and then she drills in her own plaques, which then the city, of course, promptly takes down. So she gets into this whole kind of cat and mouse game with the city about how we narrate the war. Both of these types of activism and artists force us to question who and what we choose to commemorate and why. What purpose does hegemonic commemoration serve? And how can we disrupt hegemonic forms of commemoration? Historic commemoration is a powerful form of ideology. As Stuart Hall reminds us, ideology is a practice. It is generated, produced, and reproduced in specific settings. The current public engagement around cultural memory is unprecedented. Easily, the top issue centers on who we choose to commemorate. Activists challenge monuments and markers to colonizers and enslavers. This is a photo here of Robert E. Lee when it was being removed in the middle of the night in New Orleans, and they had to do it at night because they knew so many people would be opposed to it. And then we have another picture of Columbus from the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, there's many reasons why people choose to oppose such forms of commemoration. Many feel it's offensive to honor such individuals. They make others feel unwelcome. Some say it does not reflect who we are today. Others say they're painful reminders of the past. Certainly, these are all valid concerns. The Mellon Foundation has really got involved in all of this activity and has adopted a two-pronged approach. First, they're investing millions in developing alternative commemorations focused on both the city and local level. Second, they've been analyzing themselves US commemorative practices, specifically who and what we choose to commemorate. Oh, that's not a, oh wait, that is right, okay. The idea of who we should commemorate is called just representation. And this is the idea that historic commemoration should reflect the histories, accomplishments, and contributions of the population as a whole, not just of a few. The Monument Lab, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation, recently conducted an audit of 50,000 monuments. And this data provides a snapshot of who and what we commemorate. It found that the vast majority of statues were dedicated to elite white men. 75% of them were landowners, and 50% were slave owners. Among the top 50 people commemorated, there are 2 black men, Martin Luther King Jr. and Frederick Douglass, 2 indigenous people, Sacagawea and Tecumseh. There's 3 women, Joan of Arc, Harriet Tubman, and Sacagawea, and there are no Latinx or Asian peoples at all. The audit also found that monuments misrepresent history. For example, only 1% of Civil War monuments mention slavery. This finding confirms many studies by geographers in particular, especially those involved in Project Reset, who have studied historic sites in the South, especially plantations, and have documented how slavery is or is not represented. This last finding is of great interest to me. I'm less interested in who is commemorated and much more interested in the collective stories that historic sites tell, particularly in terms of U.S. territory formation. Collectively, these stories create a narrative or a series of narratives of the historical geography and territorial development of the U.S. I argue that white supremacy and colonization are not only embedded in all historic sites, but that hegemonic commemorative practices routinely erase or deny such processes in order to preserve white innocence. Now, I define white supremacy as a set of attitudes, values, and practices emanating from the idea and practice that white people and Europe are of greater value than black, indigenous, and people of color and non-European places. Note, I do not say that whites think that they are superior. Well, many certainly do. Far more pervasive is the unspoken but acted upon belief that whites are of greater value. It is because of this greater value that their needs and desires routinely take precedence over the needs and desires of black, indigenous, and people of color. And I choose to focus on value because I see that as the lowest threshold, the lowest step in a larger and much more complex ideology of white supremacy. White supremacy is an ideology rooted in power. It is an enabling logic that facilitates material processes such as colonization, settler colonization, slavery, empire, state formation, and nation building. White supremacy is also a spatial process that was fundamental to the creation of the U.S. There is simply no way to understand the territorial development of the U.S. outside of white supremacy. It is not possible to believe that countless peoples and nations willingly gave up their land, liberty, and life so that the U.S. could achieve its current geographical configuration. I am interested in how we narrate these processes. We can think of the U.S.'s territorial development as a series of regional, racial, and colonial projects in which the nation has created multiple stories to explain how this country came to be. According to Walter Hickson, these stories are more fantasy and illusion than actual truth. He notes, fantasy is central to settler colonization. American exceptionalism and manifest destiny are both fantasies that drove U.S. settlement. In attempting to carry out their fantasies, to realize their dreams, settler colonials perceive their actions as the performance of good works. Well, there's much evidence of the fantasy and illusion. The question remains, why? The answer, I believe, is white innocence. According to Josh Inwood, we can define white innocence as the practice of denying the fundamental role racism has played and continues to play in the U.S. settler state. He notes that interrogating white innocence goes beyond documenting the denial, although that is very important. It also requires examining the very categories of white and whiteness as historical processes themselves. Remember, whiteness is not just about skin color, but rather a series of power relations and ideologies that we have created. Seen in this way, white innocence is central to the white nation. Drawing on Benedict Anderson and Sunera Thobani, I define the white nation as an imagined sovereign political community in which white people and whiteness are centered. And it's important to remember People of color can be part and are part of the white nation, right? We just need to think about Enrique Tarrio of the Proud Boys as an example. Because whiteness is a hierarchical, genocidal, and exclusionary category, its legitimacy requires the erasure of such violence. This entails the cultivation and maintenance of white innocence. I explore how the denial of white supremacy and colonization in US cultural memory function to preserve white innocence through national historic landmarks. So let me now turn to national historic landmarks. These are a particular kind of historic site. Landmark status is given by the National Park Service because a site represents an outstanding aspect of American history and culture and embodies national significance. To achieve landmark status, an individual or organization must nominate a site and show how it is truly significant to US history and culture. This is not an easy process. It sometimes takes years of hard work and money, oftentimes including historic or archaeological surveys. But landmark designation, once given, does open the door to other forms of preservation support. Currently, there are about 2,600 national landmarks in the US and abroad. We actually have 21 in other countries, if you can believe that. About 300 of these landmarks are not available to the public, and these are mostly native archaeological sites as well as military sites. But the rest are open to the public, or at least publicly known. They may be a private building, which is a private residence, or maybe an office building today, but it is known and listed as a national landmark. Now, in this project, I asked several questions. First, how are various forms of white supremacy, what forms of white supremacy are inherent in the places and events commemorated by national landmarks? How are various forms of white supremacy represented? And collectively, how do they narrate the founding and development and expansion of the US? What is the role of white innocence in this process? So I'm just going to be talking about a few of these questions today, not all of them. So to answer these questions, we created a database of the 2,300 available national landmarks. The we is a bunch of UO geography grad students and myself, Tiana Bruno, Sofia Ford, Cristina Feber-Serna, Carla Macal Montenegro, Kate Shields, Akash Upriati. And then I also worked very closely with the infographics lab because I don't know how to map things. They've been very helpful in helping along with this process. So what we did is we coded all the landmarks based on nomination materials, which are all publicly available on the National Park Service website. This is our archive. In addition, we conducted selective field work at particular sites across the country and that represent different forms of white supremacy. The fieldwork consisted of studying the landscape, exhibits, tours, docents, and literature to see how the racial past is narrated. Now, I identified 4 different forms of white supremacy, 4 different forms of representation of white supremacy. And these are erasure, valorization, multiculturalism, and acknowledgement. And I'll explain each in turn, but it's important to point out, with the exception of acknowledgement, all 3 of the top ones there are forms of denial: erasure, valorization, and multiculturalism. Altogether, 92% of all landmarks deny white supremacy and colonization. And let me describe those in more detail for you. As you can see, just over 80% fall into the erasure category. Erasure means complete silence on race and colonization. It is simply never mentioned, not even one sentence. There is no acknowledgement of whose land this once was, of the struggles to make it part of the US, of the exclusionary, exploitive, or extractive processes associated with the history of the site and its attendant geography. It is as if this site was part of a non-racial historical geography. Instead, what most landmarks focus on is architecture, 47%. Another 15% are related to the military. Together, they constitute 62% of all national historic landmarks. In contrast, according to the National Park Service, only 8% of sites pertain to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. What are we to make of such silences? Marita Sturken has argued that such practices constitute forgetting. But this erasure is on such a grand scale that forgetting doesn't seem to really capture what is going on here. I believe the more appropriate term is denial. Denial on a staggering scale. Stanley Cohen defines denial as assertions that something did not happen, did not exist, is not true, or is not known. People typically engage in denial when the truth is too disturbing or threatening to be accepted. Kari Norgaard argues that denial should be understood along a spectrum. In this case, erasure, valorization, and multiculturalism are all distinct forms of denial. Erasure, as noted earlier, is simply complete avoidance. In contrast, valorization is not just silence, but glorifying a narrative and landscape of denial. Multiculturalism is also a form of denial. Multicultural sites mention Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but deny systematic racism and colonization. This is where my work differs from those advocating for just representation. Consider Sacagawea. Most commemorations of Sacagawea celebrate her contributions to the building of the U.S. nation and territory. She was a key figure in Lewis and Clark's expedition of westward expansion. She translated, was a guide, showed them food sources, and on multiple occasions saved their lives. She is commemorated because she contributed to the U.S. territorial expansion and conquest. Never is the dispossession of her people, the Shoshone, mentioned, all right? As if this was her intent to assist in the creation of the U.S. nation. This is a slide from, I hope it comes out clear. This was taken on it's the Oregon History Museum, and they had these huge murals built outside the museum. And there's actually two murals, and what they do is they represent certain narrations of the founding of Oregon, and as well as the larger Pacific Northwest. And what you see here on this one here, we see this is Sacagawea here, and then we see also York. Now York is very important. York was a slave who was brought along by Lewis and Clark on their expedition, and he remained a slave throughout the entire journey, all right? She also was a slave as well, all right? So these are really important parts of the story that, of course, are never told. Rather, we're told as that she was so, eagerly anxious to assist in this project. So this is an example of multicultural representation. We include Sacagawea, we include York, but we don't talk about those larger kinds of power relations. The final category of representation is acknowledgement. These sites acknowledge the racial past in some way. However modest, all you need is one sentence. They challenge the white nation and its innocence by naming massacres, slavery, and other forms of racial injustice. Only 7.6% of all national landmarks fall into this category. This is a vast landscape of denial. It is not accidental. This is a common scene here in the West. Indians as friends of the pioneers, right? You can see this in cemeteries and parks and things like that, which is not to suggest that there were not Indians that were friendly and that did not assist the pioneers, right? But the stark contrast in terms of what we remember and commemorate is very, very telling. The act of creating national landmarks requires deliberate, conscious effort. As such, national landmarks are a powerful example of hegemonic cultural memory. As I suggested earlier, we engage in such denial in order to preserve white innocence. Currently, white innocence is being questioned in an unprecedented fashion. This has given rise to a tremendous backlash, what Carol Anderson calls white rage. Central to white rage is a denial of the denial, if you will. But the landscape is a powerful form of evidence. In the words of Pierce Lewis, landscape is our unwitting autobiography. Let me now share some examples of how white supremacy and colonization are represented. I start with erasure, since this is the most abundant form of denial. This is the assay building in Boise, Idaho. There were numerous gold and silver rushes throughout the West in the 19th century. Mining not only created wealth and brought settlers to what is now the western U.S., but it also devastated indigenous homelands, and in some places, like in Northern California, resulted in widespread genocide. This building is where miners brought the rocks, metals, and minerals they had extracted from the earth and converted them into cash. It now houses Idaho's Historic Preservation Program. The plaque on the building reads, "This is the old U.S. Assay Office, built in 1870 to 71, and said to have received more than $775 million in gold and silver through its doors." Consider the implications for racial capitalism, the transformation of nature into capital, the taking of indigenous lands for mining and settlement, and not a word about either the native peoples or settler colonization. Instead, there's an exhibit on sandstone, which is abundant in Idaho, an important building material. This is denial as erasure. The next category I consider is valorization. Valorization is a distinct form of denial and epitomized by the Alamo. The Alamo commemorates a battle in which Texans fought against Mexico in order to achieve independence. The Alamo, of course, is not just about Texas history, but should be seen as the opening salvo in the Mexican-American War, which lasted from 1846 to 48. And in this war, the U.S. acquired half of Mexico's territory. This battle for Texas independence shows one way that settler colonization operates. In this case, U.S. settlers moved to Mexico and became Mexican citizens. They then chafed at Mexican laws and restrictions, especially in regards to slavery, and decided they wanted independence. No sooner did they get it than they sought to rejoin the white nation. This is not a case of the U.S. state or military taking Mexican land. That happens in the Mexican-American War. This is a case of the settlers themselves leading the process, which we find all around the frontier. As we all know, the Texans lost the battle at the Alamo. So how does a site of loss become a site for valorization? First, by erasing the true reasons for the battle. The Alamo is a shrine devoted to freedom and liberty. One of the signs reads, "Between February 23rd and March 6, 1836, gallant Texans, greatly outnumbered by General Santa Anna's army, defended the sprawling compound to the death. The Battle of the Alamo stands as a symbol of freedom throughout the world." Freedom for who? Second, the site has a bit of a split personality. Inside, it is treated as a sacred shrine. You are asked to be quiet, respectful, as you are in this site where so many people died. The defeat is a hallowed event. The suffering and losses are vehicles for the purification of the cause and of the defenders. But on the outside, there is a celebratory aura. This is a fun place to celebrate Texas history. And here we can see people posing for fun. There's statues to all the defenders that you can find in the Alamo. There's all kinds of things for sale there. It has a very lively festival feel to it on the outside. The next category of denial is multiculturalism. To qualify as multicultural, sites simply had to mention Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or processes of colonization and racism. This is a very low bar. Still, less than 8% fell into this category. Mount Independence in Vermont commemorates a battle of the Revolutionary War. Located on Lake Champlain, British forces were entering from Canada into the Vermont territory. Vermont was like Texas at the time. It was its own republic before joining the U.S. A key battle was fought here, which bought U.S. forces valuable time to mount a powerful counterattack. The site includes a museum, picnic areas, and several trails with exhibits along the way. I even met these two guys along the trail. They were very friendly, and kind enough to allow me to take their picture. And they've been coming here I think for 15 to 20 years and doing reenactments, engaging with visitors, and trying to give it a really an alive feel to the site. In one exhibit, they discuss indigenous peoples. Even before the American Army straggled onto Mount Independence in July 1776, people had left their mark on the land here. For thousands of years, Native Americans made tools out of chert, a black, fine-grained stone in numerous outcroppings on the mount, and traces of their industry may still be seen on the ground. Revolutionary War soldiers appear to have discovered and been fascinated by this ancient past. Archaeologists have found projectile points in some of the soldiers' huts. Here, we see Native peoples as firmly rooted in the ancient past. Such an historical framing precludes any need to explain displacement and how this land actually came to be part of the U.S. I asked a worker about the indigenous peoples of the area, the Abenaki, as I usually do. Her response was, well, there weren't any as far as we know. The Indians passed by this area, but there were no permanent villages here. This was a common answer that I heard throughout the country. There were no Indians in this area. This form of denial is called spatial containment. Indians may have existed in some parts of the U.S., but not here where we live. The worker's statement is a form of settler memory predicated on two ideas. First, it ignores the fact that Native peoples use large areas of land in different ways depending on the season. Second, it indicates that only recognized Native presence are permanent settlements legitimized by either archaeologists or found in the English language archive. This is a convenient way of denying processes of displacement. Aside from erasure, this is the most common form of representation, and I find the most interesting. Let me now move to acknowledgement. I want to share one site quickly from Sitka, Alaska. Alaska was in many ways an anomaly compared to the rest of the US. There was widespread multiculturalism in Alaska, and even some sources of acknowledgement. I haven't quite figured out what is going on in acknowledgement. In Alaska, I have to do more work in terms of the history of the Native peoples there. I do know that they did actually write and get through Congress, or at least in the state, the first civil rights law in the US was based for Native people in Alaska. Anyway, this is from Castle Hill. And this is where the Russians transferred ownership of Alaska to the United States. One of the plaques there reads, in 1867, Russia sold Alaska to the United States. But was Alaska's theirs to sell? The original inhabitants of the land were plunged into a new era with the stroke of a pen. Now, this may not seem like a big deal, but it differs dramatically from the rest of the US. It is possible that the history of Russian colonization makes it easier to raise these concerns, as the US was not the first to colonize this region. In this case, Russian colonization provides a buffer of sorts in order to protect US innocence. I want to now analyze shifts in cultural memory. Historic commemoration is a dynamic field and has changed a great deal over the decades. Because most sites are older, they embody these older and earlier ideas about race, nation, and what is to be valued. One place where we have seen shifts is in plantations and missions. I like to juxtapose these two institutions. Not only are they sites of racial violence and coerced labor, but they were central to settler colonization. And both are treated as romantic tourist attractions. This is Middleton Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston was a leading site in the US slave trade. About 40% of all enslaved people who entered the US came through Charleston. Prior to the cotton boom in the Deep South, thousands toiled in the rice fields of the Piedmont. Not only was Charleston the wealthiest city in North America at its peak, but it was pivotal in the defense of slavery and secession. Again, it is important to see slavery as a territorial process. Slavery, like all forms of capitalism, require continual growth and expansion. the South knew that without westward expansion, their economic system was imperiled. The Middletons were fabulously wealthy. They had 19 plantations and owned over 3,600 human beings. Middleton Place became a national landmark because of its gardens. They claim it is the oldest landscape garden in the United States. Middleton opened as a plantation museum in the 1960s, but only began discussing slavery after the year 2000 in response to the prodding of the black descendants of Middleton. And I was told that every several years there'd be a gathering for the descendants of Middleton. And one year, 2000, black people showed up. And then they realized, oh, there are black descendants as well. And this really began changing the course and the trajectory for Middleton Plantation. This is called Eliza's House, and it is the heart of the slavery exhibit. It is an attempt to acknowledge the past, but it does so in a limited way. Middleton acknowledges the past through a labor-centric narrative. Not only are territorial issues never mentioned, but in Middleton's version of history, a version of slavery, there is no violence, terror, rape, or family separation. Instead, Middleton develops a labor narrative in several ways. First, it acknowledges the humanity of enslaved persons by consistently giving their names and positions culled from the ledgers. And we can see this is here, actually, all the names of the enslaved persons that they could find are listed there in Eliza's house. All exhibits, even remotely related to labor activities, feature signs that read, for example, Toby worked here in this blacksmith shop. Eliza's house actually lists, shows where the people live, but they have done a great effort at rebuilding the entire kind of the workplaces of the plantation. Although there are extensive fields, of course, that were once rice fields, and there are gardens now, but they really have all kinds of different work activities that you would find there. The second way in which a labor narrative is developed is by acknowledging that the enslaved produced the wealth of South Carolina's planter class. They built the structures, grew the crops, were hired out, and tended children. This is certainly important, and I appreciate the emphasis on who creates the wealth. Making visible such power dynamics should be a key goal of all historic commemoration. The third component of the labor narrative is a continual emphasis on the skills and knowledge of enslaved workers, especially in terms of rice cultivation. As the geographer Judy Carney pointed out long ago, planters sought enslaved persons from West Africa, Senegambia, and the Gold Coast precisely because of their knowledge of rice culture. We hear this repeatedly. It wasn't just backbreaking work, but the skills and knowledge of enslaved persons that created this beautiful landscape. At one point, a docent at Eliza's house was discussing slave labor and actually used the words, quote, economic contributions, to which one visitor replied, well, doesn't contribution imply some kind of willingness? And that's exactly what we never hear about. There's no mention of violence, terror, rape, or family separation. We never hear about the regional postbellum culture of lynchings, the KKK, and Jim Crow. We just hear about the many skills and contributions of enslaved persons. While slavery is represented as an exploitive labor system, it is not a violent one. In some ways, some of the most egregious elements of slavery are denied, and white innocence is preserved. The final site I'd like to consider is Santa Barbara Mission in Southern California. Long considered the crown jewel of the mission system, it was founded by the Franciscan friars in 1876. It is still owned and operated by the Franciscans. It's a functioning parish to this day. And they developed the museum. So this is kind of their take on the racial past. And if anybody here is from California, you know that in 4th or 5th grade, all California students do a section on California history and the missions. And I actually went to a field trip on this mission, I know on 2 occasions in my life. I was there both in high school as well as in elementary school. So I was really happy to go back very recently to do field work there. Now, as we all know, the Spanish ventured north from Mexico into Alta California and what is now the larger southwestern United States. Spanish colonization was a joint venture of state, church, and capital. Missions and presidios, or forts, were key institutions of conquest and colonization. The missions were the province of the church and had several purposes. First, they were intended to convert the indigenous population to Christianity. Second, they were vehicles for Spain's civilizing project. Third, the Indians were intended to be laborers to produce goods and wealth for missions, churches, and settlers. And finally, according to the Franciscans, missions were always intended to be temporary. The idea was that they would be given back to Native people at some point. At what point, I do not know. Perhaps when they had been sufficiently civilized? Needless to say, this never happened. I think it's important to include Spanish and Mexican colonization in this project because they illustrate how white supremacy is more widespread than just among Anglo-Americans. It was central to all European colonization, and Mexico itself, after independence, actively sought to control and contain nomadic indigenous populations. The Franciscans have put great effort into updating the narrative of the mission. This can be seen in greater acknowledgement of the Chumash, the name of the local peoples, including they have an exhibit there showing the lineage of 4 different Native families, and they have contemporary photographs tracing them all the way back to the mission era. And I think this was important to the idea that indigenous people are still here, which is a call that we have heard both from Native studies scholars as well as activists. Well, the majority of the mission focuses on the Franciscans themselves. There are exhibits on Native peoples and their cultures. And there are genuine attempts to grapple with the racial and colonial past. For example, the Franciscans acknowledge the devastating nature of the missions in terms of disease and agriculture. They note, along with plants and animals, colonists brought diseases which were not known in this area and from which the local community did not have immunity. These diseases caused epidemics and a tremendous loss of life. The role of disease in mass indigenous death has become an important question. Traditionally, it has been portrayed as an unfortunate but inevitable consequence of an encounter or an exchange. But more recent scholars have challenged this framing, noting that it was inevitable to colonization, a very deliberate and orchestrated project of domination. In addition, the Franciscans admit that the mission system upended Native subsistence. They write, European-style farming and ranching often resulted in the destruction of the natural habitat, which, before contact, supplied the Chumash with traditional foods and resources. Even with these admissions, however, the Franciscans never actually take responsibility for Native dispossession, forced relocation, or coerced labor. Despite clear evidence of Native opposition, including a revolt in 1824. Instead, the Franciscans describe themselves as the protectors of indigenous people against, quote, Spanish exploitation, which I know that they were at some times. I don't want to pretend like that was not the case, but that is not the whole story. Consequently, the overall narrative is one of an unfortunate series of events, one with limited agency and no accountability. Instead, we get more economic contributions. They write, ultimately, the colonial forces would alter the landscape and set in motion changes that would affect traditional ways of living for the Chumash, but also lay the foundation for the rancho and agricultural economy of California. We can see clear parallels here with the plantation, not only on the focus on economic contributions, but also in the cultivation of such beautiful grounds as tourist attractions on sites of previous racial violence. What does it mean that such sites are major tourist attractions and tell such partial stories? What work does this beautiful landscape do in remembering the past? In closing, despite making significant progress in cultural memory, we're still deeply invested in preserving white innocence. We cannot yet bring ourselves to tell the full story of U.S. territorial formation, and thus we resort to monumental denial. Our investment in white innocence remains entrenched and remains a key obstacle to a genuine and meaningful racial recognition. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your talk. That was wonderful. I'm still processing a lot of it and processing it in relation to something that I learned yesterday, that the CIA has put up a statue of Harriet Tubman,
Oh.
calling her the first information gatherer. And I was just curious if you had any thoughts about that. You would have some thoughts about that, but I was hoping you could reflect on that in relation to denial, etc.
That is fascinating. So I heard a news story in NPR about the CIA opening up some kind of, well, it's not even open to the public, but it's a museum, right, I guess, of some sort, trying to tell their story in a more light. I did not know about the Harriet Tubman. Wow, the first information gatherer. Well, of course, she was not the first information gatherer, although I like to see her acknowledged. There's been some really interesting kind of reinterpretations of Harriet Tubman. I know Dorceta Taylor talks about her as like an early ecologist, environmentalist, because of her tremendous ecological knowledge she must have had here in Maryland in order to get people across, right? Wow, so that's just a really powerful example of multiculturalism. Calling her, she is an information gatherer again, but of course this is devoid of a much larger kind of, I don't know, I should go see, I have to go look this up now, thank you. I don't know what's going on there, but it's super interesting. You know, and she has become, of course, just like, you know, there was the talk about the stamp about her, and then there is like the Underground Railroad, which is not a landmark. I thought it was, but it's not. Here in Maryland, there's other sites to her up in New York, where her birthplace was. I mean, so I think there's like at least 3 different types of historic sites devoted to Harriet Tubman, which on the one hand I think is wonderful. I think that's fantastic, although I think she's also doing the work of a lot of other people. And it'd be a wonderful topic just to do focus. I mean, it's Sacagawea, we got Harriet Tubman. I mean, those, interrogating those representations would be, I think, really important. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
I guess I don't have so much of a question as just a comment, but I was thinking a lot about the activist who you mentioned earlier. I can't remember her name, but the one who was replacing
Sandra de la Loza.
the plaques, yes, with ones that more accurately portray what some people feel happened. And I was thinking about how a lot of these historical sites are places where people will take their children, and that's how a lot of children learn about history, is to have their parents take them to these historical sites and be walked through by a tour guide. And I guess it's really scary to me to think about how a lot of kids will just have that one narrative taught to them, and especially with all of this critical race theory discourse going on in law right now. It's really terrifying to me to think that a lot of this information can be lost to children, and how I really appreciate activists like that trying to give some kind of opportunity for people to actually learn what happened.
I mean, if you're anywhere near I'm 60 years old. This is all there was, you know, growing up. These were the narratives, and I guess at some point early on, I just thought, what's wrong with this story here? You know, you begin questioning what it is, and which is why I decided to actually do the project, just to show like just how biased it is. It's very powerful, and like the docents are totally fascinating. You know, again, that's a whole other project, but I've been to one. This was around Campo de Cahuenga. I remember being there, and a docent actually telling somebody, well, it's not really like they were at war. I mean, it's just like, wow. I mean, it's really just kind of erasure of a war because, again, investment in white innocence, right? Or I went to another place in Utah, and one of the docents there, I asked about, well, what about the indigenous people? It was the Blackfeet in particular, this case around here at Fort Cove. And, well, you know, they weren't here when they came. That's just what you hear over and over again. They were not here, you know? So it's staggering, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thanks for such a great talk. I was curious if you saw any temporal trends in any of these sites. Like, did you see any, changes over time? Was there, constant erasure, or was there any, improvement as, more awareness was brought up over time?
Yes, you can see that in two ways. First of all, Middleton is an example of change. I mean, they radically changed. They spent a lot of money researching it, and then they produced a book on it, and then they redid their exhibits. So, despite its limitations, that is change. The other way you see it is that I don't think today anybody can get through a landmark site based on some of these older narrations. It's just not going to fly. Somebody now will be like, usually the people involved or the people in NPS will say like, no, you're missing, you have to talk about these other issues as well. So I do think there's been a fundamental shift. And also in conversations with people in NPS, they were very clear, like sometime in the early 70s, after the civil rights movement and the various power movements, anti-racist movements, they were deliberately going and seeking out to tell the stories of non-white peoples. So the Sand Creek Massacre site in Colorado, which is not a landmark, it's a monument, and it is, according to the NPS, the only recognized massacre on the part of the U.S. military in the United States. But that was like a direct response to like, we need to be telling more of these stories, right? And the proliferation of Harriet Tubman too, that also is evidence of that. So there really has been a big change, yeah, a shift. But it's just dwarfed by decades of this other stuff, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering whether there were a significant number of sites that also had this explicit, like white supremacist messaging in their telling of history, in addition to this implicit white supremacy.
Yeah, so we consider those sites of valorization.
Okay.
That's what we consider there. Where they're just kind of like, yeah, and so we came and we decided to, we're going to improve the population by, wiping them out or, things like this. We found, particularly around Native peoples that exist. A little bit less so around Black people, but mostly about Native people. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Something I just found really interesting is how in acknowledgement they always put the works that were being done by many people onto the shoulders of one person in particular. Because there was not only one Native American who was being forced to translate and help find new lands to colonize, and there was not only one African American woman who was helping other slaves escape from slavery. We always say Harriet Tubman or Sacagawea when we talk about those two, which kind of minimizes that role.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a really good observation, really good. It's a form of containment, right? It wasn't so widespread, right? We can have this one person here who does that kind of work. Really good. Good point, yeah. You find that everywhere. Mm-hmm.
Your Alaska example makes me wonder, were there national monuments in places like Hawaii and Puerto Rico? Was there a similar kind of difference?
Good question. The Hawaii one, I did go to Hawaii there, and so Hawaii is interesting. It has quite a number, but most of them are, they're archaeological. However, there is Pearl Harbor, which had, this had a great narration about how the U.S. came to power. They talk about in whatever year it was, 18 whatever, there was the Organic Act, at which point the U.S. took possession or took ownership of Hawaii. And in other talks of this, I didn't do this one today, I do think about them as sites of contestation where people actively challenge them. And Hawaii has one. The Iolani Palace is where the queen was disposed, and a group of activists there, like on one of the anniversaries, realize, oh, this is horrendous, the story that's being told, and so they do a reenactment. And they do a play in 6 different scenes, and they tell the story from from the perspective of one of the sugarcane workers, from a Greek merchant, from a Chinese community member, stuff like that. So that's an active pushback, around what has happened. And so you see that too, that's part of the temporal changes also that you see, the pushback. Mm-hmm.
It'd be great to hear what you're planning to do with this from here forward. You mentioned the collaboration with Infographics Lab and conversations with NPS. Are they open to hearing more about the sort of categorizations that you were able to distinguish with the?
I don't know if how open they'll be. I'm sure they will. I am sure they will. Most, not all, but people that are really professionals doing work in historic preservation and cultural memory, they are interested in it, right? And I will distinguish them from like docents, which are kind of everyday people. They go through a training process and then they're put out there, right? Anyway, so I'm working on Historic Atlas with the Infographics Lab, and they're like training me how to do an atlas, which is really hard because I have to learn to write in little bits and pieces. But we're doing that work. We're creating a historical atlas called Monumental Denial, and I don't know how long it's going to take. You know, I don't know. I thought, oh, it could be done. We can finish it in a year, and they're like, oh no, it won't be. You're crazy. And but I'm working on that. And then if I have the energy and strength, I know it should be a website. I just really don't like to do that, and so I want to maybe I could just find somebody and the money to hire somebody to make the website. Doing websites doesn't give me joy, but I think it'd be a really great project to be accessible for everybody. Yes. Mm-hmm.
First of all, thank you so much for this presentation. I'd like to take you back to the beginning, and I'm gonna be unfair and ask you to speculate long term about this cultural moment and where we're headed. So, you showed that map with the various laws, the states that have tried to propose laws to essentially bury all this information in. There is, however, a lot more knowledge coming out into public view than was the case before. So you've had this work, you've had things like the 1619 Project.
Right.
Clint Smith's book, How the Word is Passed. If anybody has not read that, you should go read it right away.
Agreed.
And so many other things, the unearthing of what happened in Tulsa and so many other places with massacres. The objective of a lot of this is to make people see things that they can't unsee. The objective of the people who are trying to roll this back by not allowing kids to learn about it is to make them never learn about those things so that they won't have that experience. But if you take a 10, 20, 30, 40, 50-year view, I don't see how they can unroll it to the point where all this stuff is obscured from view. You can't unlearn it once it's learned. What do you see in terms of where we're going to be over the coming decades with regard to this understanding?
Yeah, I don't think it's an unfair question at all. As long as we all know it's just, you know. I agree. I think there's the cat's out of the bag, right? And you can't put it back in the bag. And what I see very much as the CRT rules, or those kinds of efforts, they're the last gasps in some ways, of those efforts to deny it, right? To deny the denial of it all. So, on the other hand, we can look at the state of the nation and the U.S. and where are we headed in general, and one might see it could just become also two different, two different nations in some ways, just as we have this. Patchwork of abortion laws, we also might have patchwork, different kinds of racial knowledge and understanding in this country. Although, again, that is limited because it's public information. You can get it. You can't. You can ban Clint passing the word book in a school, but you can get out of school and read it, kind of stuff. So I do. It's it's the struggle, it's the conflict, but it's I think moving that direction. Yeah. Was there, yeah?
One last question. Be mindful of time.
So based on your collecting information on landmark locations, do you validate local people's knowledge of the location or more of a credential knowledge of the location?
I do not validate local people's knowledge. This is completely all about the credential peoples. This is an upward analysis of the state and elites. So yeah, it is not about local people at all. I mean, in some of them, I do talk about local people, particularly like in Hawaii, and there's the counter work that happens. But no, this is looking upward and critiquing the state in terms of what's happening.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr.
Thank you. Thank you.